Today's focus is Jesus, joy, and responsible hedonism. Now, for those of you who think I have lost my mind, I want to remind you that I take very seriously the idea that God became flesh in the personhood of Jesus. He was not a disembodied spirit, but an embodied spirit, as are we. And as such, Jesus was the door, the gate, and the way to understanding God and life's meaning. We are, each one of us, made in the image of the divine and bear this strong resemblance to God. Not as disembodied spirits, but as embodied spirits in these bodies. And Jesus was about an abundant life, both in the words that John gives him out of his mouth, but also according to his critics in the book of Matthew, a glutton and a drunkard. This sounds like a party kind of guy, and that's what we're going to focus on. So first, because progressive Christianity is in dialogue with science and does not put it down, we stay in conversation with science. I want to tell you a little bit about science, about what it is to be human. Neuroscientists tell us that desire for pleasure is a part of human nature. Perhaps we have to learn to accept that the human brain makes us disproportionately interested in pleasure. I love that. We seek out that gooey chocolate icing on that cake, right? And we seek out, let me just climb this mountain and watch that sunset, right, on top of the mountaintop. And we seek out the excitement of a new lover, for example. All right, so we're wired that way. Our brain looks for pleasure. That's brain science. 2, energetically, as humans, we want to feel something. Energetically, we seek a charge. We like the high charges. That's important. But if we fail to get a high charge, we will settle for a low charge. And a low charge we get from shame, from guilt, from anxiety, confusion, and so forth. Perhaps that is what drives some of our addictions. From some people, their life is not what they need it to be, want it to be, what it should be, and they don't have the highs energetically, so they settle for the highs that come through addiction, which leads to a low charge eventually in terms of what they do in their life. So there's that energy aspect of our humanity. Okay, so with the brain science, we've got the energy thing happening. Thirdly is sociology. We are social creatures. We cannot live without one another. We can't even formulate who we are. Our identity is formed by looking at the image of mother and father and neighbors and children and siblings and so forth. That's how we know who we are. We are not islands unto ourselves. Now, we are also all wired to give to one another because that makes us feel good. Serving makes us feel good. Being kind makes us feel good because people appreciate who we are. It's called altruism, and scientists study that, and we love it. We are made for one another, to be good to one another. Cooperation feels good, right? The reality of being a social creature is pleasure. And lastly, biologically, every human body has one place on their body that is there only for pleasure. I'm not going to get into biology here, but if you need a clue on that, ask me afterwards. So biologically, we are made for pleasure. So look at all of these levels, yeah? One would conclude from that God is a pleasure-seeking God, right? God doesn't have any trouble with us having fun. That's how we are wired. Matthew Fox, a Christian theologian and author, writes, "For those committed to the experience of ecstasy," now I'm not sure the church is committed to that, but we're going to put that out there. He writes, "A new commandment is in store. Pleasure first. But take pleasure not only in your own pleasure, but in others' pleasure, the way God does. the way the Creator does with her creation, become like this pleasure-loving, pleasure-sharing God. A pleasure-loving, pleasure-sharing God. Do we have such an image? And if not, why not? Why is this problematic for some Christians, some church folks? What does God have to do all day? Matthew Fox asked. And Matthew Fox's answer is, God enjoys God's self all day. Does our God sit and condemn, sit in judgment? Or is God enjoying life through us? So we're going to go deeper into Scripture, but first I have some more bad news about science. And science tells us that pleasure is a toggle switch inside ourselves. That when pleasure is turned off, violence becomes more likely. And they have done research that shows that people who physically abuse their children are themselves deprived of pleasure. So if we turn off the pleasure button, we will turn dangerous. Let that sink in. They have found that on a societal level as well. James Prescott, a neuropsychologist, studied culturally who are the cultures that restrict and repress pleasure, specifically sexual pleasure, among your youth, and then studied violence. And there's an absolute correlation between those societies that restrict and repress and those who have huge military budgets. Guess where the U.S. is in that? Okay. Ashley Montague studied the problematic effect on psychological development and behavior of people who are deprived of touch, especially children. So we need to take very seriously that the damage of guilt and shame that inhibits affection and touch for one another, but also for our children. So let's talk about pleasure and hedonism. I just want to tell you that my dad was the farthest thing from a hedonist. He didn't appreciate the sensual, as far as I can tell. When he was a farmer, and when he mowed the lawn and he saw flowers, he would mow them down because that impeded his efficiency. You know, he was on a path there. He ate food because it was a fuel, not because he enjoyed it. You know, mealtime was simply a time to catch up on the farming. So his way of being in the world perfectly describes a Protestant work ethic. You see, he was in church every time the church doors were open. Highly observant Christian Protestant man, right? So in actuality, his Protestant work ethic was part of his faith. What that meant was his faith was about deferring gratification. Deferring pleasure, that's for heaven. Right now, we work hard. We produce. I think he had 2 more 10 commandments. One of them was, thou shalt work and not play. And the second was, thou shalt take pleasure in production, but not in the pleasure of sensual. Kind of sad, actually. I mean, he was a good guy, but he just was disconnected from pleasure, and it had nothing to do with his faith. So that's my story. But religion, Christianity, is grounded in some of these very bad ideas that are anti-pleasure. Okay? We are going to thank, or not thank, St. Augustine for that. Happiness for him was not for this life, it was a reward for afterlife. We are condemned to live on earth to suffer, and we should be content with delayed gratification. And he had a buddy named Saint Jerome. They were saints after they died, of course. And they were contemporaries, and they had done some very shameful things in their youth. They went out and sowed a lot of wild oats. And then they spent the rest of their lives in deep humiliation and guilt and shame for all they had done. And they wrote that into their theology. And guess what? That's the theology that gets handed down to us to make us want to work and produce rather than play and have fun as a part of our faith experience. Thank you very much. You couldn't even have fun if the person you were having fun with, you were married to. Let's be clear. That was only for babies. All right? So we might apply the words of socialist revolutionary Emma Goldman, who said, if I can't dance, I don't want to be part of your revolution. Now let's revise that to say, if we can't have lots of joy and pleasure, we don't want to be a part of your religion either. So, even though we seriously need pleasure, both as a human species and as a society and culture, too many churches are saying you can't dance because we know where that's going to lead, right? It's going to lead to hedonism or acting out. So why is the church so hard on pleasure? Well, we're just going to turn to our Bible on that. And when we turn to our Bible, I'm sorry, folks, we got bad news in that Bible because it says not a whole lot of good things about pleasure. This is what they say. The house of pleasure is the heart of fools. Ecclesiastes. Treacherous, rash, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. That's from Timothy. Peter says, we find those ideas of pleasure is to carouse in broad daylight. And Jesus tells a story of the seeds that are sown on 4 types of soil. And one of those is those lives who are choked by worries and riches and pleasures. And Titus says that there are those who are foolish, disobedient, deceived, and enslaved by all kinds of passions and pleasures, living in malice and envy, being hated and hating one another. So, as is evident, and there's many more of those, I just chose those, there are many more, the writers are not really against playfulness and sensuality or even sexuality. What they're against is irresponsible hedonism. They're against those being so self-absorbed that it's all about me. And I don't care about your pleasure, it's all about me. That's what irresponsible hedonism is. And I turn to King David for that one. He coveted Bathsheba for himself and used her for himself, for his pleasure. He wasn't thinking about her. He wasn't thinking about her husband. He wasn't thinking about the consequences. It was all about him. I would call that irresponsible hedonism. Or perhaps there was hedonism in the 12th chapter of Luke, when Jesus' parable of the man who hoarded his grain into silos. The land of a rich man produced abundantly, and he thought, what should I do? I have no place to store my crops, he says. And then he says, I'll do this. I'll pull down my barns, and I'll build larger ones, and I'll store all my grain and my goods, and I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? And so it is for those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God. Treasures for themselves, pleasure, it's all mine. It's all about me and my future. He did not enjoy the here and now. He did not look around to those sensual spaces around himself. Thou shalt work and not play, my dad said. Irresponsible hedonists are always looking into the future, how they can make their life better and more pleasurable for themselves. They do not stay in that present moment. Responsible hedonism is always about staying in the here and now. Who's with me? Here. What is the sensuality around me? Here. Taking pleasure? Here. Now, Matthew Fox writes, Jesus was not primarily a teacher of information, that is, what to believe, or morals, how to behave, but a teacher of a way or path of transformation. And the fact that the early believers in Acts were called followers of the way tells us they understood what this was about. It was a different frame. It was not the world's frame of me first, it's all about me, irresponsible hedonism. It was a different frame of here and now, God's world, God's people, God in me, the sensual and, yes, sexual. They knew not to be conformed to this frame, but to transform themselves through a different frame, a different way. I think Jesus' followers got a high charge out of loving one another, out of caring for one another, and being unapologetically who they were. Lepers and tax collectors and prostitutes and women, a motley crew that had a good time being community, following a different way than the world's. And I also think that the scribes and Pharisees got a low charge because they couldn't handle the high charge happening here. They were operating out of another frame, so they had him condemned and crucified. They got a low charge out of that one. Right? When I think of the way, when I think about this way we are to be, pleasure is a natural response. Okay, so I'm just going to tell you some of my claims. 1, love is all there is. That's it. Love is all there is. It's the underlying reason for our laws, for our religions, our way of being in the world. It's Love. Okay, on the other side of that, claim 2. The power of love that is ours to tap into is stronger than any fear of death, of destruction, of evil, of the White House, of ICE. It's greater than that. No fear, F-E-A-R. No fear. That's what the way is about. And a third one. The vision of love is to make the earth as it is in heaven, where the blind receive the sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed. You got that? It's about service to one another. To live in this frame is to know joy. Now, some of us today are not feeling too joyful because we got some bones that are creaking and a little arthritis going on because of the change of the weather. I get that, right? Joy is not happiness. Happiness is going to come and go. I got money in my pocket, I'm feeling pretty good. I'm feeling pretty happy. No money in my pocket, I'm not feeling happy, right? But joy is, remember, it's a path. It's a frame. It's a way. It's a way of being in the world. So even if my bones are creaking today, I can still know joy because I know the path I am on. Okay. No fear of anything. Love is everything. The churches of Macedonia knew joy, and they were going through a very difficult time. This is in 2 Corinthians. Paul writes that they have an ordeal with affliction, and they're living in extreme poverty. And yet, he writes, they have overflowed in a wealth of generosity. They voluntarily gave according to their means and even beyond their means. That's an example of what happens when we live in joy. We become generous people because we're plugged into one another. Joyful is in the dark, and joyful is the day. Because love never abandons or forsakes us. Love never dies. Love is the underlying reason for life because love is present with us here and now in this moment in one another. And that's the resurrection story, folks. Nothing stops love. Now, you're not going to believe this, but I have two women I know who have made a conscious attempt to live a pleasure-centered life as their life focus. They put a lot of energy in this, and they've done a lot of study on it. So I talked with them about this sermon. I said, okay, help me out here. And they said, love is the goal. Pleasure is the way. So I'm going to suggest we take a note from the experts in this field. Who are the experts of play in this society? It's children. Their earliest frame is to seek joy and pleasure. They play in the present moment, in the here and now. They don't worry about tomorrow. Here and now. So here are the words of my daughter as she wrote about her son at the age of 2. When was the last time you got excited about seeing the moon and stars? Have you looked at them as if through the eyes of a 2-year-old? I cannot explain what they are. Doesn't matter. They are lights in the sky. They can be anything. And does it matter who turns on the lights when you enter a room? It does if you're 2 years old. The power of light is right there in your own hands. Such power there is to allow yourself to see and to allow others to see all by yourself. How wonderful! And when was the last time you hopped? Just for the sake of hopping. Count to 3 and jump. Again. Feel the muscles. Enjoy the feel of your body as it returns to that of being a child. The frame we use to follow the way is joy. We are wired for pleasure and have fantastical faith promises of goodness and power in an ever-present, ever-flowing, abundant love that is totally irrational. That is reason for joy. My title, Joy, Jesus, and Responsible Hedonism, simply means love is the goal, pleasure is the way. Just be kind.